Hello and welcome. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers50. Thank you for joining us for the Thinkers50 2023 Ideas Premiere. This is a smorgasbord of great ideas and fresh thinking from people in the Thinkers50 community to whet your appetite for our awards gala extravaganza in London in November. Taking place at London's historic Guildhall, this year's awards gala is shaping up to be the bigger, bolder and better than ever before, with a packed programme featuring the creme de la creme of management thinkers, including Amy Edmondson, Rita McGrath, Sheena Iyengar, Scott Anthony, Andrew Winston, Amy Webb, and many, many more. You can expect to mingle and connect with some of the top minds in thought leadership should you come along to the Guildhall. We do have a few tickets still available. For those who do not already have one, see the link in the chat. If you can't make it to London but still want to join us, a few virtual tickets are also available. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who's joined all the conversations over the last 2 days, and thank you to all the speakers and contributors. And thank you also to our partners and coaches, the Brightline Initiative, Exec Online, Fujitsu, Deloitte, Coaching.com, 100 Coaches, Wiley, the L Group, MCT, and India's Institute for Competitiveness, as well as world-leading business schools, IMD, INSEAD, IE, Questrom, and HULT. To remain competitive and thrive, organizations must innovate and quickly adapt to ongoing change. At the same time, they also need to act with urgency to help tackle climate change and the complex social challenges that have brought sustainability to the forefront of business priorities. But what does sustainable behavior in organizations really look like in practice? And how can businesses balance growth with environmental and social responsibility? To provide some of the answers, perhaps all of the answers, let's not overpromise. To provide some of the answers and stimulate our thinking, we have assembled a great group. Leading the discussion is Steve Goldbach of Deloitte. Steve is co-author of Detonate and Provoke, two much recommended books, and leads Deloitte's sustainability, climate, and equity endeavors in the United States. Steve is joined by Michelle Dunstan, who is Director of Responsibility at Janus Henderson, which manages more than $322 billion worth of client assets. We will also hear from Brian Evergreen. Brian, shortlisted for the Thinkers50 Breakthrough Idea Award, is the author of Autonomous Transformation and founder of the Profitable Good Company. And we are joined by Liz Altman. Liz is a professor at the Manning School of Business at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Liz is co-author of the book Workforce Ecosystems. So it's a great lineup. Leading the conversation is Deloitte's Steve Goldbach. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Stuart. And this is an awesome group to interview today. And I feel like we should disclose that Michelle is not just a fan of Detonate and Provoke with multiple copies in the background. Michelle and I are actually married, and she's sitting in our kitchen where I've stacked her background appropriately. But I'm looking forward to a lively discussion today. I'll watch the chat to see what questions you have. But I guess maybe as a framing start, Michelle, Brian, and Liz, I've come to see over a lifetime of working with management teams and a lot of thinking with my co-author, Jeff Tuff, that we see that innovation tends to happen when major orthodoxies are flipped. Whether it's the orthodoxy of, for example, a grocery store, giving the best service to its worst customers, right? Like the express line in a grocery store where we literally, allow the fastest service to the customers who are buying the least. We need to flip those kinds of orthodoxies to grow. And I think the same thing is true for addressing the tackling of sustainability. And I think it's just from the standpoint of the audience, when I say sustainability, I want to make clear that I'm addressing a broader topic than simply climate change, although that is a critical topic. But I believe we can't have a sustainable future where we have inequities. So equity is a super important component of having a sustainable future. But I guess the question to each of you, and maybe Brian, I'll lead off with you, is as you think about the challenge of sustainability. One orthodoxy that I've observed is this orthodoxy where executive management teams seem to think about, on the one hand, we can be sustainable, or on the other hand, we can be profitable. And that just feels like an orthodoxy that needs to be flipped. And I'll ask each of you how to share a challenge that you would think of it based on your work. So Brian, maybe we'll start with you, and then Michelle and Liz can come next.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you, Stuart, and to everyone for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here and to be among the Thinkers50 community. So the first thing I'd say in terms of your question, Steve, is that I think that often there is I don't know if it's a misconception as much as just a false understanding, right? That there is that you have to choose between profitability and doing good or sustainability. And I agree with you that that's an orthodoxy that I think people have run into. I can say from my experience as a former leader at Microsoft that we ran into that quite often, where we'd have C-level investment from engagement from both organizations, from Microsoft and then one of the customers that we were working with. We would have fly back and forth to each other's headquarters, and all with the goal of some I would say equitable or sustainable, climate related. It could be one was around child labor, guaranteeing there's no child labor in the supply chain, and more often than not, fitting it into the systemic conditions of both organizations, often chalked up to profitability, ended up being a real challenge. And I think that a lot of that does have to do with systems thinking, and the idea that if you begin with saying, okay, within this one quarter or within this one fiscal year, this decision that we make has to continue to yield the exact same or more profit than what it is that we've been doing up until now, then of course, I mean, that is a recipe for any change to fail. And so I think longer term thinking and measuring how you're going to go about something like this with a more strategic lens that's not just about a quarter, a fiscal year, or even someone's career term, but rather great example is the guaranteeing no child labor in the supply chain. If they could actually solve that, any one chocolate company, and then given a certain Halloween or a Valentine's Day or whatever holiday where the most chocolate is sold, they could come out and say, these are the 20 candy bars that we absolutely, like, UN certified. This is guaranteed there's no child labor in this supply chain. Imagine the profitability. But that's not something that you can easily and empirically prove when you're embarking on that endeavor. So I think that I agree with you that I think there's a lot of paradigms that need to be flipped. And I think part of it is trying to empirically prove profitability in a short term, which I think is a recipe for failure in any change, let alone trying to do something good.
Yeah, it's interesting how sustainability gets this micro focus on it versus any other innovation. Sometimes we say fail fast, and we'll try to address it. Michelle, I'm curious, as Chief Responsibility Officer for now, as your second term with a second major investment management firm, how do you think about that orthodoxy from an investor perspective?
Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Stuart and Thinkers50 for enabling this discussion on this really interesting and important topic. And I think Brian is right. Is the historical point of view has been that you can do one or the other, but not both. I think there has been an evolution. So it started there, then it moved to, well, sustainability is a nice to have, and maybe something that's going to bring us benefits way down in the future, but it's not something we need to think about today. What I think is that corporates and investors like Janus Henderson are increasingly of the belief that this is actually impacting our investments today, that it's not just a nice to have, and actually paying attention to sustainability issues today is better preparing for the future. And let me just give you an example. So let's just say you own a factory that emits a lot of carbon. Is carbon being taxed in the jurisdictions in which you operate today? If it is, that's a cost to your company. What if it's not taxed today, but could become taxed at some point in the next few years? You should take that into account when you're planning, if you're the company, or when you're an investor, knowing that cash is going to go out the door in a few years. Or what if there is no tax, but that factory is going to have to upgrade its equipment to deal with pollution? Again, that's a real cost out the door. What if that's not going to happen, but a competitor has developed a lower carbon alternative? Individuals and businesses are changing the way they're evaluating their products. Is your company going to lose market share? Or what about people? Younger people in particular are making value-based decisions on where they want to work. We've seen a lot of the oil and gas companies slide down the list of desirability for new engineering grads. What's that say about their capacity for keeping costs low or technological innovation when they're getting bottom of the barrel talent? All of these things are today impacting cash flows, capital expenditures, valuation, and cost of capital. Companies are taking action to prepare themselves for the future. And that means investors like us need to do our research to understand who is prepared for the changing times and who isn't, and what their strategies are, and whether or not we think those are going to be beneficial and address the emerging risks and problems. So I think that mindset is changing, and we are starting to believe that a lot of these issues are financially impactful today. That dichotomy of one or the other is fading away.
Well, that's good to hear, and I think it's a good segue into what I suspect Liz will talk about. Michelle mentioned workforce, and I know that that's the area of your expertise. How are you thinking about the issues of sustainability as it relates to workforce issues?
Great. And I also want to echo everyone else's thanks to Thinkers50 and to Stuart and to Steve and the other panelists. I think it's a great conversation, and our even preparatory conversations have been good in terms of thinking about these topics. So yeah, I study platforms and ecosystems kind of primarily, and more recently in the past few years have then taken platform and ecosystem thinking and brought it to workforce with my colleagues actually from Deloitte and Sloan Management Review. And we published a book this year called Workforce Ecosystems. And so I've been thinking about this as you've been talking about, orthodoxy. And I would say when we talk about a workforce ecosystem, we think about an ecosystem spanning not only employees, but also contractors, gig workers, freelancers, outsourcing, also technologies, chatbots, AI. All together, what does it take these days to pull together the resources that an organization needs to accomplish their goals? And I think in terms of orthodoxy, it's interesting. Last night, I was at dinner with a friend who is in an organization, and we were talking about how the organization, it's a public organization, basically a nonprofit organization nonprofit organization that charges other organizations to be a member. And I said, how do you choose, what is the cost structure basically? What's the business model? And her answer was, well, we charge it based on headcount, in Massachusetts, right? And so I said, okay, is that headcount employees or is that workers, right? Because what we found is it's reasonable to say these days 30 to 50% of an organization's workers are contingent in some way. And she kind of paused and said, we do it by employees, but now that you say that, maybe we shouldn't, right? And so I think this notion of thinking more broadly about who is contributing, and then and how you define a workforce in that way. And then I think the tie to sustainability is taking this broader view of how do you get, so ecosystems by their nature are open, they're highly diverse, they have relationships, interconnectivity, interdependencies. That's what they are basically. And so I think they allow organizations to have the resources they need, when they need them, how they need them, where they need them. And for workers, and we can talk more about this, it allows many workers to work when they need, how they want to work, etc. I am not saying they're perfect in any way, shape, or form. We have all kinds of complications about difficulties with contracting and precarious work and problems for workers. But in general, our research is starting to show that these types of ecosystem structures lead to more sustainable, equitable approaches to thinking about organizations.
And it sounds like, Liz, one of the major rocks that companies need to or think about, or at least reframe, is thinking about not just their workforce as their own employees, but the sets of contingent workers, the sets of gig workers that they have, and possibly even, you know, the workers that work through the value chain as Brian described in terms of the supply chain and what do you have in your labor landscape. Maybe I'll ask another question to all three of you, and I'll start with Michelle. What are the other, as you think about tackling the issue of sustainability and making it a business issue, as opposed to not just a moral issue, what are the other big rocks that need to be moved? Michelle, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think one of the things that we need to do is reframe what kind of investing can actually drive change. So if you look at the history of responsible investing, it started out as the old SRI, socially responsible investing. And that was really about exclusions. It was, I don't like, name what you didn't like, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, whatever. I don't want to see that in my portfolio. We've broadened out a bit since then. The next wave, which has really been over the past, let's call it 5 to 10 years, has been ESG integration. This is becoming table stakes everywhere. So this is where there is a financially material, environmental, social, or governance issue. You should be treating it the same way you treat any other financially material issue, which is incorporating it in each appropriate stage of your investment management process. That has slowly become table stakes, certainly in Europe and most of the rest of the world. That actually is a better evaluation of risk and return and leads to improved financial results. But we need to broaden from there. The next wave of ESG focused portfolios were really sustainable portfolios. Those generally are focused on the best of the best, companies who are doing everything right. And we definitely need capital allocated to rewarding those players in the market. But until recently, that was kind of the range of investments that you had. As more people have focused on this and are willing to put their money behind it, we've seen it broaden out, and we need more people to think this way. It's not just about rewarding the leaders. We need to invest in a transition. So, for instance, a couple of areas that are emerging but don't necessarily have as much backing are ones that are really going to drive change. The first is investing in solutions and enablers. Companies whose products and services enable others to improve. So this is solar, wind, hydrogen, things that are going to make the world get better. That's an interesting area for investing because they tend to actually grow faster than the market and are actually good investments too. The second area is the one that's really neglected. And this is what I would call improvers. These are companies who may not be the best of the best today, but are on a journey to get there. So for instance, only 25% of the world's oil actually goes into passenger vehicles. Even if we move to 100% EVs tomorrow, that's not realistic. You're going to need oil for decades to come. And what powers your electric vehicles? It's mined commodities, lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel. Rather than ignoring these companies whose products and services are going to be part of the economy today and tomorrow, investors should be looking to drive them towards improvement. And that's what we can do through our research, through our engagement, through our stewardship and proxy voting. So it is broadening out the range of investments that are acceptable to drive change rather than only focusing on the best of the best.
Liz, I'll come to you next, and then Brian, what are the other big rocks that you think need to be moved?
So again, I think I'll go back to workforce ecosystem, right? I think thinking differently about how we structure employment relationships, and I'm maybe jumping ahead, but I think there's a regulatory aspect on this also, that how we look at what's an employee or who's an employee versus who's a contractor. There's a whole conversation around the Uber drivers, for example, right, where California passed a law saying Uber drivers need to be treated as employees, and then many of the drivers said, no, we don't want to be employees, right? Like, we actually like working both for Uber and for Lyft. I don't want to have to show up every morning at the same time. I don't want to be told when I'm taking a break or when I'm having lunch. I like the flexibility. So I think think we need to think about that. I think there's a huge amount of emphasis right now on remote, and back to the office and in the office and not in the office. And I think too much, that's all important, but too much emphasis on geographic location and not enough emphasis on how are we compensating people? How are we letting them work? Who is working for whom, in what capacity? I think starts to, we're missing, some of the key points around these topic areas. And I guess I'd quickly add to that, there are implications then that we could talk a lot about on leadership, technologies, management practices, all of those pieces. I see we have, questions about business models. I think as you think differently about organizations and take more of an ecosystem mindset, you have implications for business models, for leadership, for technologies, et cetera.
And maybe that's a good tee up for Brian. You've been thinking a lot these days about the role of AI. How do you think about the intersections of AI and sustainability and its impact on all issues like workforce and equity? Is that a big rock, or is that a solution, or how are you thinking about that?
Oh, perfect timing. So I would say that I think of AI as a tool. And I think we live in a world that I call it tool worship, and a lot of my former colleagues and I myself have fallen under the idea that if we pick up this tool and we look for the next nearest problem, we're going to be able to solve it with this tool. And I think that I liken that to if you're in your home and you receive a saw for your birthday, or for, a skill saw, let's say, and you stand up and you start looking around your home for how am I going to fix whatever the next nearest problem that's been bothering me in my home. No one would do a remodel that way, right? You instead forget about the tools and you think about, well, what do I want different about my bathroom or my kitchen? And then once you've redesigned that and come up with what you want, then you work backwards to say, okay, what are the regulatory codes and where does a fire alarm need to be, or whatever it might be. And then eventually when the work is approved, then you look at what tools. And so I would say AI is neither the savior nor the villain when it comes to this topic or any others. It's just another tool. And in terms of your bigger question around big rocks that are maybe in the way, there's really two things that I would point to that are top of mind for me. One is that is problem solving. I think that we often start with what problem do we need to solve? And that sounds very intuitive, but problem solving is the craft of getting rid of what it is you don't want. But it doesn't necessarily have bearing on getting what it is that you do want. And in the sustainability conversation, or conversations around diversity or equity or creating belonging, those aren't problems to be solved. You can't get rid of something just to get into a more sustainable future. We actually have to create things. And so I think we need to replace, not necessarily the whole company, because we still need problem solvers, but I think we need future solving, where you start with the end in mind of saying, well, if we wanted to be in a future where we were 100% sustainable and we weren't mining these precious materials that are also not sustainable and that we also don't feel are being mined in an equitable way. If you start with that future in mind and say, that's the future I want to be in, and then ask the next question of what would have to be true for us to create that future? And then what would have to be true for those things to be true? You can create a very clear line of investments from where you are to that future that you want to be in. And many of the problems along the way that you were thinking about solving might actually end up dissolving themselves because you're already moving forward in a specific direction. And that's the first big rock. I'd say that the second big rock I'd point out is that most of our organizations we've run our organizations and have been taught how to run organizations like we've inherited it from the Industrial Revolution, and to treat them like large mechanical machines. And when you treat an organization like a mechanical machine, again, it tends towards problem solving, but also it means that the way that you treat your people is inherently like cogs in a machine. Liz, this kind of ties into some of what you were saying. And I think up until very recently, treating people like cogs in a machine has been a way to continue being profitable. You could profitably do that, and you could get away with it. And I think now we're finally reaching a point where it's quickly becoming unprofitable. And we're seeing really strong proof point in the market that treating your organization, recognizing it as a social system, and then the ecosystem around it as a social system, fundamentally, it's a group of humans coming together to try to do something. So then things like the sense of belonging and meaning and connectedness between them, and all these things that I think were considered extracurricular in past leadership paradigms, now become core curriculum when you're recognizing that it's a social system. And so I think that when we try to treat a sustainability initiative like we're gonna do a steam train up that mountain, and we're gonna get there and treat our people like cogs along the way, and we're just gonna check a problem-solving box, I think it is a recipe for failure.
So maybe this is a good segue into, a topic that is hot. I had the opportunity earlier today to interview Andrew Winston, and one of the things we talked about was this anti-ESG rhetoric that is out there. There's some questions in the chat. Jacob asks, is having a chief sustainability officer role an actual solution, or is it just an illusion? Another, Alexandra, asked, do companies really care about climate change, or is it just something you have to add to your website under CSR? I guess let's ask this from a positive frame. If you're a company that actually wants to be part of the solution, what are some of the better practices you've seen in terms of engaging on such a challenging and sometimes polarizing issue? Do any one of you want to take a first crack at that? I'll point it. Michelle, looks like you're smiling, and then we'll come to Liz.
Sure. Oh, you can see it, Rebecca.
Okay.
So I would say, let me divide it into a couple of things. One is the political discourse that's here in the US today. And a lot of things are being conflated in there right now. Some of it is a very historical lens, which people are viewing sustainability as either not being material. And they tend to view it as one of two things: either the widespread exclusions, where if you're excluding a lot of universities, it's really hard to generate the risk return characteristics clients are looking for, or they're thinking of it as the opposite, which is are investment managers or companies making decisions based on touchy-feely things, like, does the company have a therapy koala? I mean, it's cute and everything, you can cuddle it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really have an impact on the outcomes for that company. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these issues that are actually having an impact on companies today and will increasingly impact the way they act and their financial outcomes for the future. So what I found, and we're a large investment manager, we engaged with companies, over 1,100 companies last year on different ESG topics, including over 600 on climate change. It's about tying it back to why this makes them a better company. So for instance, in terms of board diversity, we don't ask for board diversity just because it's the right thing to do or a nice to have. Obviously, it is the right thing to do and nice to have, but you can show that companies with more diverse boards, more diverse senior management teams, and more diverse workforces outperform. And secondly, it is much, much better if you can tie it back to a specific instance. So for instance, take one retail company in the US. This is a company with 80% of their clients being women. No women on the board, no women in the C-suite. How is this company making the right decisions for its future in terms of strategy when they literally have no one who looks or thinks like their customer in an oversight position or a decision-making capability? So when we talk with companies, it is always tying it back to why we think this makes them better. It's not hitting them over the head with the sustainability angle, but showing them that link between sustainability and either risks or opportunities. And we find that goes a long way towards reframing the discussion, not just you need to do this because it's sustainable, but you need to do this because at the end of the day, this is going to make your company either more profitable, better position you for the long run, help you beat competitors, et cetera. That's how you get the C-suite's attention.
So that's how you engage as an investor. Liz and Brian, like, as you think about the companies that you've been working with, how do you think about getting them to reframe the conversations they're having internally? How do you think about convincing them to get ahead of it? Liz, you're nodding along, so I'm going to come to you first and then go to Brian.
So always the danger of being like the active listener and being nodding along. So I guess I was thinking about we had talked a little bit earlier about technologies, right? And so I was thinking, we have put forth a framework of 5 different categories of technologies. And so kind of getting a little bit into the details. I think this might be a helpful way. We use these 5 categories to think about workforce ecosystems again, but I think it's possible that we could use these 5 categories also to think about how they relate back to making an organization more sustainable through workforce ecosystems and otherwise. So the 5 categories are work tech, workforce tech, workplace tech, credentialization and verification technologies, and then technology as a participant in a workforce ecosystem. So as Brian mentioned, kind of tools, we include AI, et cetera. But I can give you quick examples of each, because I think it gets to the little bit more nitty gritty of, what types of technologies are we talking about? And we came up, by the way, with this framework because we realized we were having these very broad conversations about technologies, and we were often talking past each other, both as researchers and consultants and managers as we were talking to people, because some people were thinking in terms of technologies that were enablers. So for example, work tech is the technology we use to do our work. So even word processors, spreadsheets, any tools that you're using to do your work. Workforce tech is the technology we use to manage a workforce. So all the HR systems, all CRM systems, all kinds of systems like that. Workplace tech gets at Zoom, Slack, collaboration tools, and those are much more enabling technologies than actually driving the work. Then credentialization and verification technologies, seeing more and more need for understanding who actually has what they say they have in terms of credentials, certificates, not only diplomas and degrees, but certificates, badges, all of these new ways to show competencies and to show skills. Because I think these types of ways to show skills and actually does help with equity and does help with flexibility, because you're figuring out new ways to determine how people can contribute in an organization or in a workforce. And then finally, this technology is a participant where, so I was in an Uber yesterday, and is the first time I had heard that the phone said to the driver, "Brian, drop off Elizabeth at the Sheraton." And I thought, okay, that's pretty clearly technology acting as a manager, because Brian needed to do exactly what his phone or an algorithm told him to do, right? So in that case, there's no question technology is acting, has a role in the workforce, right? For better or worse. In this case, I would say probably generally better. But I think thinking through what roles these technologies play can help us think more broadly about, first of all, what do we mean by sustainability, and then how do we achieve it?
Brian, how about your perspective on how companies can get ahead of the framing of it? I know that one of the things you and I were talking about before we launched this was, your desire to make everything more human. And I was wondering, like, what was it before we decided to be human? I can't imagine what the other focus might be. I mean, how can organizations reframe some of these conversations to tell the story of what they're trying to do well and avoid some of the skepticism that's out there?
So first of all, I have to call out Liz for letting everyone know that I shadow and work in the evenings for Uber. And so I hope you enjoyed your ride.
In Toronto.
Yeah, I make the commute up from Seattle. So great question, Steve. I would say that, the way that in terms of what we've been doing all this time is I think that that underlying belief, maybe under your question, I'm going to make an assumption, is that a lot of us, and I say us, the capital U, have been trying to treat people in a good way and do good things in the world all along. So what are we talking about when we're saying, creating a more human-centered organization? It's already made up of humans. There's lots of good people that we've known and worked with all along. And what I mean by that is that our fundamental leadership system, which we've inherited from the Industrial Revolution, And we see that still, the fact that we're calling things Industry 4.0, we're talking about moving into Industry 5.0. I think that it's time for us as leaders to collectively decide to say thank you to the Industrial Revolution for all that it's given us, and to move into a new Renaissance or Enlightenment level era, especially in the age of all this complexity with technologies and social challenges. We know so much more than we've ever known before, and we have more power at our fingertips. And so this underlying leadership, to describe the leadership principles, it really came out of Taylorism. And it was one of the main things that we can trace back to and say, and Taylorism, was Frederick Taylor, who at the time, Theodore Roosevelt said, the greatest challenge facing our nation is a question of national efficiency. So if you emotionally imagine it's 1911 and the Model T has just come out and you're basically inventing the middle class, and at least in the US, and so now we have all these goods and products that people want, but there's no real efficiency. There's no comparable quality between products that are being made inside of these new inventions called factories. And so the first ever management consultant, Frederick Taylor, went in and he and a team used stopwatches to attempt to apply the scientific method to management and say, we'll time how long everyone's doing each process. We'll document all the different ways. This is where process mapping came from, process optimization. I mean, Lean Six Sigma grew out of this, like all these different things, and it's pervasive across our culture, in organizational and leadership culture, and fundamentally treats organizations like a large mechanical system based on viewing the world through a deterministic worldview. And so it's not that a given human like yourself or myself or any of us come in thinking, I'm going to treat people like cogs in a machine. But then when it's time to make a decision, what are we basing our decision on? We're basing it on numbers solely. We're not documenting that Liz, who has all these credentials, recommends we do this, and that's why I'm putting I'm accepting that risk because I believe in her expertise. Rather, we're saying these are the numbers and they stack up, and I've empirically improved ahead of time that this will work out and be profitable, and therefore I'm going to invest in it. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to blame it on the numbers. So even people who inherently, I would say, are very human-centered, who care about other people, as soon as you put on your management hat to go make a decision, we immediately shift into a mechanical mindset. And so I think that that's what I mean when I talk about that sort of human-centered shift that we need to make. And as building on that example, I'd say that moving from being data-driven, which for most organizations has actually become unscientific, because the scientific process begins with a question, then you develop a hypothesis, then you run an experiment, analyze the results, and then form a conclusion, right? In most organizations today, it begins with asking a question, forming a hypothesis, gathering data on stuff you've already done and other organizations have done, analyzing the results of those to form the conclusion, which is the investment decision. Then you conduct the experiment, but rather than calling an experiment, you tie people's performance to it and say, we already proved in advance that this should work. And so it's actually become unscientific in our culture of how we make decisions. And I think we need to evolve beyond that to reason-driven decision-making, because we are ultimately commissioning expeditions into the unknown. We don't know, especially in the areas of sustainability or our most complex challenges that we're facing. We can't prove ahead of time if it's even going to work, let alone be profitable, but we can use our reasoning as humans. And so if we document our reasoning and make our decisions on the combination of data and reasoning, I think that's an elevated and more scientific form of decision making than what we operate with today.
Brian, I couldn't agree. I couldn't personally agree more. I see data more and more being used, not nefariously, but as the arbiter. And of course, there's no data about the future. There's no data from the future. All data inherently is from the past. And therefore, every time you're basing a decision on data, you're effectively extending the past into the future in some way, shape, or form. And for what it's worth, as a now reformed strategist for the last 3 months at least, as I take on this new challenge, I would welcome Kate's idea of sunsetting the word industry. I've always found, for better or for worse, when you use the term industry, it puts these blinders on executive team cognition and creativity, because all they tend to do is compare themselves to those within the box that is their industry. And I've always maintained that it's a dirty word in strategy, because the comparator is not, your competitors in your industry. The comparator ought to be any company who can replicate your where to play, how to win choices, in terms of satisfying your consumers. Let's talk about a couple different challenges, and I think this is something that's I'd like each of you to weigh in on. So I believe that as we think about, so we're going to pivot on to the topic of data, because you raised it, Brian, bless you. We're going to pivot on to the topic of data. And one of the things, I'm not a sustainability expert in the least. I'm learning and getting up to speed as I take on this new challenge. One of the things, I'm increasingly developing a hypothesis that for thousands of years, we've had a single ledger within business, and that's an economic ledger. And in order to address climate change, I do wonder, are we going to need a different ledger in business associated with greenhouse gas or other ESG related issues? I mean, maybe Michelle, I'll come to you first. What data do investors need, or what visibility do they need in order to make investment decisions? And then Liz, maybe same question from a workforce standpoint. And then Brian, how do we think about leveraging tech to serve up the needs, again, not to make decisions, as you said, but rather just to, have some visibility to what the world looks like?
It's a really good question, Steve, because it's interesting, because a lot of investment decision making is based on data. And like you pointed out, most data is historical. It's really hard to predict the future. And on a financial basis, there's a whole realm of people out there devoted to forecasting financials, whether it's sell side analysts, economists, buy side analysts, investment firms. And I think over the decades, there's been a more standard set of vocabulary in terms of thinking about how to think about how revenue is going to grow, and margins and cash flows, and therefore what might a valuation multiple look like in a few years. People don't always get that right, but there's a common set of language and a common set of data that most people look at. When it comes to sustainability, ESG, we just aren't there yet. People are talking about different things. People are measuring things in different ways. It is almost all backward looking. And what little forward-looking metrics there are, so implied temperature rise, CVAR, for instance, are typically assumption built on assumption built on assumption built on assumption, which are based on data, which is actually assumptions, and going into a world where we don't really know exactly how climate change is going to evolve, because there's kurtosis and skew and cascading events that are going to influence the future. I think some of the big problems that we see are, one, the consistency of the data. Two, for climate change, I think, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, we're pretty much set on those, but how do you calculate them really varies by industry. I know Columbia University has a program right now that is trying to merge together 60 different frameworks for carbon accounting in the mining sector alone. And you can imagine how that gets, bigger and bigger and bigger. But take something like the S pillar, social. Cybersecurity, very different from workforce management, very different from modern slavery. How do you get data on these kind of things? Or even things like biodiversity. So there are a lot of issues where it's very difficult to get good data on, and forward-looking data. So people are relying on an inadequate set of data. People are relying on estimates. People tend to rely on a lot of the so-called ESG rating agencies. They have their own shortfalls. They're doing the best they can, but again, backward looking, trying to smush everything down into a single letter grade, and largely relying on web scraping, which is about what you disclose, not what you're actually doing. So what firms like ours are doing, and everyone's investing a lot of money in this, is we have to do our own research. We actually have to talk to the companies. We have to understand what their strategies are, what their plans are. Is that credible? Does that make sense? What are the milestones I can look for to see that you're actually going to hit that? That is very time consuming. It's very labor intensive, and not everyone can do that. So, we are seeing some amalgamation. We're seeing regulation. A lot of the regulation so far is not materiality driven. So everyone needs to report on, say, exposure to biodiversity. When like you're a healthcare company, you're going like, I have no exposure to biodiversity. Please ask me about employee training and marketing practices, which are much more adherent to me, but don't apply to a mine. So we'll get there, but it's going to be a long road. It took us like a century to really kind of nail down the global accounting framework.
Of course, we don't have a century to work on this, but we'll get there. Liz, how about for the data from a workforce standpoint?
So it's a really interesting question. I think I'm going to shift to a different example, maybe a little bit off of workforce, if that's okay. So I've done some research with the United Nations Development Program on their, they have a program on which is called the Accelerator Lab Program. And we wrote my colleague and I wrote an article in MIT SMR called Accelerating Innovation, something about what one can learn from the United Nations. So good, I can see Jacob, Steve's notes and Jacob's note. Excellent. Well, we'll see if I can touch on it. So in any case, I think the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, has done a fantastic job figuring out how to use very resource-constrained, a resource-constrained business model, where they started with 60 labs serving 78 countries around the world. So, you've got one in Croatia, you've got one in Mexico, and you've got all of these, Lebanon, Slovakia, they're all around the world, and they have 3 people per lab. Those labs then work with UN offices in those countries and ministries and schools and communities together. So they basically build their own little local ecosystem, and then all the little local ecosystems work together in this broader network. So we dubbed it a network of ecosystems. They've now adopted that, and we continue to work with them on it. And so I think, so one of the things they've had to do, tying it back to the metrics and what Michelle was talking about, they need to think about how are they going to measure these various labs, right? And they're not doing it through finances, right? So the question is, how do you know if a lab is successful? And of course, they're going towards trying to solve the SDGs, which are, of course, enormous. And they have done a very good job of starting to pull together some types of metrics around engagements, around participation, around impacts, around sharing information. They have excellent ratings, by the way, for the various labs through, so you can look up UN Accelerator Labs Program and see different articles about the different labs. And I'd highly recommend those who are interested look at it. We're starting to think about a little more research with them, because I think they're very forward thinking and they need to figure out what data they need and how they can share data. And in that case, it's around the world. So it's globally, and it's different types of projects. So, but yet you want to have some way to measure, across projects, across labs. And so it's a, as we said, or when we were younger, it's a gnarly project, gnarly problem. But I think they've got a lot of really good people thinking about it. And I think that Stuart just posted the article, the link for the Accelerator Labs. So I am trying to learn from them, and I would encourage others to do the same, because I think they have some really great people and they're doing some really great thinking about how to address some of these problems, including around data and metrics.
Brian, I'll give you the last word on it. Is there any interesting role that technology can play in at least getting the right data or the right visual data in front of management teams to tackle this? How are you thinking about it from the autonomous transformation perspective?
So I'm going to share an example. It's less about, in a way, it's more about, I would say, boldly going out and doing something. Because, earlier you mentioned how there's certainly some rhetoric against going against ESG, especially lately. We've seen this last couple of weeks. And the truth is, change is really, really hard. It's way easier to maintain whatever the current system we have. And if we are resistant to change, you're going to look for any excuse that you can find to not change. And so what I would say is that an example, and this also, I think, hopefully helps also address the sort of ecosystem example of reinventing business models. And I don't want to go as far as say total reinvention, but I think maybe, an example of profitability plus sustainability. And that is that I think that often people are looking for, what is someone else already doing that I can leverage as an example that we can then do? And I think we're in a space now where there's so much, and it reminds me of someone else having the icebreaker in the Arctic, not to be too on point with the pun or analogy here, pun intended, I guess, but like waiting, who's going to man the icebreaker? And once they do, we'll all follow through. The truth is, in the complexity of the 21st century, there's just too much surface area of ice for you to wait, any of us to just wait for someone else to take hold of the icebreaker and go, and then try to all slip through behind those few bold individuals. I think everyone needs to be bold and to charter their own icebreaker to some degree, and embrace the fact that those are experiments that are going to be conducted. They're commissioning expeditions into the unknown that, once it turns out, if it does turn out, can be immensely profitable. And if it doesn't, it was an experiment in the first place, and that's okay. We learn, and we can share that learning with others. And so an example of that is something, speaking to your question about autonomous technology specifically, is something we did at Microsoft, where and it's not one of the big flashy things. We realized that the chillers for air conditioning were suboptimal in their performance, and they were basically copy pasted the settings from building to building. And it was set once at the beginning of the cycle, and many years later, despite the fact that there's changes in temperatures and seasonality and humidity and other things, that it was basically on the same setting no matter what. And so we basically took some data, and we created an autonomous agent that just controlled that autonomously. And we found across 10 buildings that we experimented on this with a 17% reduction in carbon emissions, which I think if we span that out across all of our buildings across the Microsoft campus would have been, I don't remember how many hundreds of tons a year. And so what we realized is, okay, and then we looked for, well, how much does that account for in terms of global CO2? And we realized that given the amount of CO2 emissions that are coming from just cooling buildings alone, this one very small piece, if every commercial building in the world did it, it'd be a 2% global reduction in emissions. So we started to get pretty excited and realized, from an ecosystem perspective, the Puget Sound, the local energy, we were able to get rebates on our lowered energy cost because of the sustainability impact. And then we could partner with building management companies, and we could partner with, consulting firms to fan this out. And so it's a no-brainer for customers because they're saving money while also reducing emissions, which is good for their stories and good for personal meaning. And so it's a win for everyone, and there's no reason it shouldn't catch fire and span across the whole commercial world. So I think that's an example to me of, I guess, it wasn't leading with the technology, it was leading with, oh, that's interesting that we're doing something so inefficiently. How would we fix that? And then realizing, oh, that's something that we could apply some business model and ecosystemic innovation to then really drive as far as we can.
It's a good example of being able to leverage the tool, as you were saying. It's the saw analogy from previously to do a job. Colleagues, I'm going to ask one last question, but I'm going to give you a second to think about it. Guys, and in the meantime, I'm going to answer a question myself from Robert in the chat. So the question is going to be, and it's got to be quick because we're going to close soon, but what one change have you made in your personal life that has reduced your personal carbon footprint? And because I want to give people examples of simple behaviors that they can take and apply. So Robert, you asked a question in the chat. What's the overlap between company culture and sustainability? I think the way I use this question to draw our panel to a close today is to address, we believe to address climate change, I think you've collectively heard from this august group that we need to work sustainability into your strategy, right? Your business strategy. You need to make it about the business choices you make, because addressing sustainability is a long run shareholder, stakeholder, employee, customer benefit, right? It's better for customers, right? It's better for employees. It can be, and it can and will be better for shareholders by addressing these systemic risks if you do it. Culture is a strategy choice. I know people are fond of quoting Peter Drucker, who purportedly said, but it can't be found where he said it, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Personally, I think that is not the case. Culture is a strategy choice. I like to think about strategy as the 5 choices of winning aspiration, where to play, how to win, capabilities, and management systems. And culture is a management system choice. It's a derivative of the questions that executive asks, how people get evaluated, how they get promoted, why they get hired, why they get fired. That all those things are management system choices that are strategy choices that executive team make to shape their strategy. So I don't think that there should be any gap between your company's culture and sustainability. I think it needs to be part of it, but that's all going to come from executive choice. And so I think, given we're on the topic of choice, so what choices have you guys rethought in your lives around sustainability? And then I'm going to pass it back to Stuart.
I'll just give you a very simple one. I think all of us noted it maybe during deep in the pandemic, but trying to figure out, especially while I'm on sabbatical, how to commute a little bit less. So I think it's, generally speaking, it's better for me to be working from home when I can pull it off.
Cool.
I'll go with a couple. Lowering carbon footprint, whether that's vehicles, whether that's solar on, our house, whether it's walking to work. Also, food waste, trying to reduce that, because that is another larger source of emissions.
Yeah, leftovers for dinner tonight. Ryan.
I would say a combination of what you said, well, both of you said to some degree. I think lowering and asking as often as I can is something that can be done virtually, as well as I think, in my day-to-day life, just thinking through, how am I reusing as much as I can. Even I have a couple little ones, so even certain types of things that would have been recycled now can be recycled in the home, in the sense of becoming a fun craft, or then going up on our wall is something that we're particularly proud of, and not, try not to burden the recycling system.
Excellent. Well, mine is I take the subway everywhere I go now in New York, and Michelle can attest to that. Stuart, over to you.
Less flying, less meat is my contribution. Thank you, Steve, Michelle, Brian, and Liz. That was a broad-ranging and stimulating discussion about issues which are incredibly important, but undeniably difficult and challenging to our systems, leaders, and organizations. Inclusive leadership has been our red thread throughout the last 2 days. To tackle the issues of sustainability and climate change and social inclusion, we need inclusive leaders and smarter collaborators. Look back at our brilliant session with Heidi Gardner, which kicked off things yesterday. We need to ask questions and acquire insights from different perspectives. Check back on the session on questions of perspectives with Hal Gregerson and Pia Lauritsen and others. We need to create working conditions and environments where we can all thrive, regardless of our personal circumstances and preferences. I remember the Work in 2030 session yesterday. We need business education that meets the aspirations of the next generation of leaders, B schools fit for purpose. Look back at our session on B schools for better, led by John Byrne yesterday. We need healthy bodies and minds, and to be kind to each other. Our Minds at Work session yesterday covered this brilliantly. We need leaders with character who put principles above personal gain. The character of leadership and its relationship to AI was something we covered earlier today. We need to see ourselves and our organizations as part of something bigger, an ecosystem that creates economic and social value and also protects our natural ecosystems. We had a great discussion earlier on ecosystem leadership with Greg Bernarda. We also need organizations and leaders who are resilient and future ready, on the front foot and leaning into the prevailing wind. Our session with Howard Yu and Mark Greven really nailed this with a huge amount of energy and knowledge. And we need to live with and embrace uncertainty, recognizing that no leader has all the answers, that we are stronger together and by being inclusive, both because it is better for business and because it is the right thing to do. And we had a great session on the Thinkers50 book, Certain Uncertainty, earlier. And finally, we must find ways to be kinder to our planet, to create sustainable growth for our businesses, economies, and people. So thank you for joining us, and thank you all for the great contributions to the dialogue and conversation. We hope you can join us in London on 5th and 6th of November. We will be releasing the program for the event next week and can promise a lot of great speakers, boundless conversations, and brilliant networking. The final tickets are now available, and we mean final. All the details can be found at thinkers50.com. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you soon. Thank you.